All right, I think we're ready. Let's get this started. I guess to start off, first of all, thank you to all of you who have made it to the event today. My name is Sayre Quevedo. I am the teaching artist here at OHMA for 2022-2023. And this is our fourth and final Thursday oral history salon. We've hosted 3 others. There are recordings available online in case you've missed them. And just to give you a better sense of kind of who I am within the context of this program and this event, I am a documentary artist working for the most part with audio at the heart of most of the works that I do. And I'm really interested in sort of the relationships that are organic to the documentary process and also the relationship between oral history and documentary. And so that's what a lot of my students are kind of working through. And what we're sort of working through in these events. And so I highly encourage you to check out the last 3 events that we've done as well that feature Connie Walker, Maria Hinojosa, and well, you can't see the last one because it was in person, but you can see the other 2 online. And I'm, as a curator for this event, I've been really particularly interested in understanding sort of questions of power, ethics, and craft through the relationships in these works. And so as I talk more and more about my work at today's event, you'll probably get a sense of that as well. Before we begin our event in earnest, I want to acknowledge that at Columbia, we are working on the unceded land of the Lenape people who were violently dispossessed from this place. We honor their roots here and the strength that is taken to resist and rebuild both here and elsewhere. As oral historians, we also acknowledge the roots of our practice in Indigenous oral history and the ways in which our field has excluded Indigenous people and practices. And this acknowledgement is only the beginning of a process of building and honoring Indigenous land, people, and knowledge into the practices of oral historians for the purpose of healing, reconciliation, learning, resurgence, and the pursuit of justice. And I'll say on a personal note that I'm a big fan of moving beyond acknowledgement. And so if you would like to take action in supporting the sovereignty of Indigenous peoples across the US, here's a link for an article that helps sort of go beyond land acknowledgement. And again, that is a starting point. And as this is the last event, just drive it home. Saying these things is really nice. It can feel polite, but I think moving beyond that into action is even better. And so I will be presenting some of my works today, and then I want to try to leave some ample room to talk with you and answer your questions and hear what you think about what I've just presented. And so I'll try to move fairly quickly. It's a lot, I will just say, it is a lot to do an artist talk. I've been working in audio since I was 15 years old, and I'm turning 30 in 5 days. So it's a lot of ground to cover. And there's a lot that's been excluded. There's a lot that I just did not have the time to try to explain. And I encourage you to go to my website if you're curious and would like to know more, or just ask during the Q&A as well. I'll try to leave a little bit of room, like I said, for that. And thank you for the birthday wishes. I appreciate it. It does feel especially fortuitous to be in the space, to be talking about and reviewing sort of the work that I've done up until this point. And, it feels like both the simplest and the most difficult task to talk about my work, despite sort of the autobiographical nature of a lot of what I do. I find it very difficult to talk about myself. A lot of the ways that I talk about myself is within the work itself. And I found it easier to communicate through a microphone, and maybe you'll understand more of that by the time that we've gotten to the end of this presentation. But what I make is so intertwined with who I am, and who I am is so intertwined with the community of my family, with the places that I grew up, the art that I was exposed to that, what I've experienced, that it feels erroneous to not sort of include that and to not start with a bit of biography. So I will be telling you a bit about myself. Oh, are we missing? Hold on, I hear. So I will be talking a little bit about some of my life, actually a fair amount of my life, and also sharing some work, some art and film, pieces of art and film that have also influenced some of the work that I do. And I share so much of this biography, again, because what I've come from and the context in which I was raised has informed so much of my practice and the kind of work I've done. And so with that, I will, in earnest, begin the presentation. Give me one moment. Hold on 1 second. Okay, now we're ready.
And December 4th.
I think I'm getting a little feedback from someone.
Take a break, or
I'm going to mute you. Sorry. There we go. All right. You're getting a little sneak peek of what's to come because it started in the middle. So I was born on November 22nd, 1992 in San Francisco, California. My mother, the story that my mother tells about the birth of my brother and I, my twin brother and I, is that she didn't cry or scream during labor because she was afraid that she would annoy the nurses and they would go away. I was the second of 2 twins. If you look at this photograph here, I'm the one that's sort of like looking, I'm on the right, I'm looking sort of like melancholy off into the distance. My brother is the one that's looking very cute and staring at the floor. My mom raised us in the Bay Area, and I'm going to show you a quick video here. The sound is off because it is very annoyingly static. But as you can see, this is a video from, I believe, my 3rd birthday. This is in El Cerrito, California. This was the 3rd home that we had lived in by that point. And as you can see in the background, there's a casket that my mom kept in the living room. My mom was very goth, and she hid it beneath a bed sheet, I assume to not scare off children. And like I mentioned, this was about, I think, the 3rd house that I had lived in, or this is the 1st house that I lived in. And the 1st house that I can remember living in, like as a child, I have memories of this house. And yeah, but like I said, we didn't live in any house for longer than 4 years, between the ages of 1 and 18. And I had a very happy childhood. But I would say that there was definitely a feeling of being unanchored at certain points. And I know that I craved the experience of a singular home. And so this is one of a handful of VHS tapes of my childhood. And it ends very abruptly. And I'm just going to scroll through here really fast so that you can see this kind of scary clown. That's my brother. It ends very abruptly with a video of a guy sleeping in bed with the TV going. And my mom says that she has no idea who this man is or why there's a video of him sleeping for the last 20 minutes of this VHS tape. There's something in the quality and nature of this document, its sort of disjointedness, its mystery, its intimacy, that does feel very appropriate as I begin to talk about my own work. So with that, come back to the presentation here. This is a diary entry from when I was 8 or 9. By this point, we had moved for the 3rd time. And I initially, admittedly, feel some embarrassment to share this, but I also think it's, again, very connected to my larger practice. And when I'm able to sort of sit with the experience of feeling embarrassed about it, I'm able actually to read it and to see, I think, that this was a child who felt very alone and who was craving a sense of belonging and was seeking it out in other people. And maybe who falsely believed that other people were sure of their place in the world, that other people had a sense of belonging, and that he could somehow evolve into a similar kind of person by being in proximity or relationship with them.
Can you read it to us? We can.
Yeah, I can read it. It's I know my handwriting at 8 was not great. So it says, today was a real bore. We had to go to the dog park, even though there were cute dogs. I was really bored. I wish I could play with my friends. Oh yeah, I forgot I don't have any. I feel like nobody likes me. Even though my old school could use a cleanup, it was still very cool. I can't wait till Roy sleeps over. I wonder if this journal could ever be published. There's a lot to unpack in this, just in this short paragraph. But I will just say, I hadn't opened this journal until I started working on this presentation a couple of months ago. And I flipped open to this page and immediately felt this sense of relation. Obviously it is me, but I felt this sense of sort of continuity in terms of the sense of yearning that I think I had as a child, and as a result of some of what I'll get into next. And I think that this sense of longing is one that's been passed down through the generations. So my mother largely raised us on her own. She left home when she was a teenager. She cut off her family. We'll talk a little bit more about that when I talk about the Quevedos. She worked, she organized politically, she partied, she traveled to Europe. I asked her about it a few times, and this is from a piece that was not in the Quevedos, that was just part of a conversation that I recorded with her, sort of asking about this period of time before she had us.
So I came back, was a stripper, made money, discovered this really interesting thing, and you don't know this about me, but discovered this really interesting way of being that I had never known, that I couldn't remember ever knowing, which was like being really carefree. All I did was work my stripper job and party and buy nice things. That's all I did. You just get up and you go. Like, you don't sit around kind of going, what about rent, and where will we find food, and how will I get my mom out of the hospital? How do I forge my mom's signature? I remember this like epiphany of thinking, oh, this must be what it's like to have a childhood.
So when my mother had my brother and I, who are in this picture, she raised us herself and with a community of friends who became our family. And my birth father was not around. So growing up, my blood family consisted of my brother and my mom. And we had other family, like I just mentioned, right, sort of non-blood related family. But we were kind of an island, my mom, my brother, and I. And my mom tried to fill in the blanks of our history as much as possible, but I think it was a tricky balance for a few different reasons. One, she barely knew that history beyond her own experience. Like I mentioned, she left when she was a teenager. And so she had very limited exposure to her family's history beyond sort of, again, her own experience and what she had been told as a child. And the second reason is that she was traumatized by what she had experienced in her own history and couldn't or didn't want to remember parts of it. And then third, I think she had to try to tell the truest version of her story while also trying to not scar us as children, as a way of protecting us from the things that she had experienced. And so that meant that I grew up with a lot of absences, a lot of gaps in history, and that created a lot of tension for me in terms of understanding who I was, where I belonged in the world. And my mom tried to fill in those gaps with art. So this is a poster. This is not the poster, but it is a version of the poster that I grew up with. I've had ever since I was, a really little kid. I can remember this poster hanging in our kitchen. And it's a poster that's in support of the FMLN, which were the guerrillas in El Salvador. And briefly and very incompletely, I will tell that history in a few lines for those of you who do not know, which is that El Salvador experienced an armed conflict officially between the years of 1980 and 1992, though that is debatable. The government fought and killed its own citizens, sort of in the name of fighting communism after they rose up to try to change sort of a regime that had been basically a cycling of autocrats for the last several decades. And thousands were killed and or disappeared, and military and death squads were financially supported by the United States. Again, this is a very brief and a very incomplete version of this history. And, my mom told me what she knew of the war when I was a kid, right? And she had been born and raised in San Francisco. And so she had only witnessed it from afar during her early 20s. And her family hadn't talked much about it, except for her father, who supported the government. And so one of the other exposures to this history that I got besides this poster was through poetry. And as a kid, my mom helped me memorize this poem, which is a poem by a very famous Salvadoran poet named Roque Dalton. And I will read it to you very quickly. It says, "Like you, I love love, life, the sweet smell of things, the sky blue landscape of January days. And my blood boils up and I laugh through eyes that have known the buds of tears. I believe the world is beautiful and that poetry, like bread, is for everyone. And that my veins don't end in me, but in the unanimous blood of those who struggle for life, love, little things, landscape, and bread, the poetry of everyone." So I understood from a young age through this poem and through the books and posters around our home that what little history we did have connected us to a much larger story of the world. That even though we were few, we belonged to something much older and much more complicated than we could imagine. But of course, there was very little way for us to locate ourselves within that history, within that world at large, because my mother, my brother, and I had been dislocated by intimate violence. I don't think I had the words for it growing up, but I can say that in my experience, having no traceable history creates a sense of yearning and a sensitivity to the world. And it is these absences within my mother's and my history and the longing they produce that I think have largely informed my practice. For so much of my life, I have felt lost. And I think of the urge to understand the world and the people around me as maybe an urge for belonging, to locate myself. And I've documented the process of searching in one way or another through the stories of myself and the stories of others across the last 15 or so years. So in my teens, I attended a public arts high school called School of the Arts in San Francisco. I studied creative writing. I was encouraged to apply by my mother, who is a poet. I too also mostly wrote poetry, which is maybe not surprising again, considering what I've just shown you. And my sophomore year, while I was in school, part of being in this creative writing department at the school was that you had to do an apprenticeship. And at the time, for context, podcasts were not really a thing. This was 2009. So podcasts exist, like podcasts, the app on GarageBand existed, but podcasts as sort of like a thing in the mainstream had not quite caught on. But for whatever reason, I was tasked with creating a podcast for this creative writing department, which I did not do at all. I just, smoked cigarettes with my friends and like walked around. And eventually, like 4 months in, the person who was in charge of this apprenticeship caught on and was sort of like, "You haven't done anything. When are you going to make this podcast?" And I said, I don't know how to make a podcast. I don't even know what a podcast is. And so they encouraged me to check out a nonprofit organization in Oakland, California, at the time called Youth Radio. And Youth Radio is a nonprofit that teaches young people basically how to make radio, how to create news stories, how to create music, how to host a radio show, how to make video, all types of media. And they have, at the time, they were the official youth desk for National Public Radio. So they had a newsroom that young people would work in, and they would write commentaries. They would help, with the help of sort of mentors, help create feature-length radio stories from a youth perspective. And I'm going to play you a bit of the first story I ever made, which is, again, after this, I will stop embarrassing myself. I'm just going to show you the embarrassing parts of my life so that I can front end that process. But this is the part from the first story I ever made, which was about weed legalization in California and about whether it was safe, whether it would encourage young people to smoke. And so this is, I'm just going to play you a few seconds of it because I will get incredibly embarrassed if I play more. So give me 1 second.
But anti-marijuana groups say this misses a more insidious effect. Liberalizing pot for adults, they say, might encourage more use among kids. They point to high rates of teen pot smoking in places such as California's Bay Area, where medical marijuana is commonplace. To look into this, we turn to Youth Radio. High school student and reporter Sayre Quevedo sent us this report.
Two of my best friends, fellow 11th graders who go to school in Berkeley, are self-described stoners.
Right now, I am breaking up the herb and putting it straight into the paper. Some people break it up into their hand, but that's just an extra step and you lose weed.
Yeah, 'cause like weed's expensive,
And while smoking that joint is normal for them, it's still an illegal substance, so they'll remain anonymous.
Okay, so I'm sorry. It's very. I mean, as I'm sure many of you experienced, it's very odd to hear your own voice. It's very odd to hear your own voice at 15 or 16. I think I was at this point. So that was the first story I ever produced for National Public Radio and for youth radio. And yeah, I think I was about 16 years old. Also, I'm clearly, this is Reverend Jesse Jackson, and this is taken during the Democratic National Convention. So up until this point, I think I had mostly interacted with writing through an artistic relationship that was largely reflexive, right? So how was I seeing things? What did it make me feel? How could I best express myself, my point of view, my idea? Sort of like focusing on the craft and expression as an outlet for my own thoughts, right? And not for those of others. And that's not to say that there wasn't a bit of that at youth radio. Obviously, it was a newsroom that was focused on youth perspectives. And as you can tell from this first clip, we covered a lot of subjects. But it was, again, at the end of the day, a newsroom, right? And I realized through working in news that there were forms of writing that could benefit everyone, that could highlight their perspectives, and give others the gift of being listened to, which across, the first, I would say, 5 years of doing news reporting, I realized it was a rare gift for a lot of people to have someone just sit down and ask them questions and listen to what they had to say. In other words, I was learning that the work that I did could have a life outside of just my internal world and my perspective. And so I started as an intern at 15 at youth radio. And after I graduated from high school, I went on to work full-time in their newsroom. I was promoted to a staff in their newsroom and became the head of their juvenile justice desk and produced a number of features for NPR, Marketplace. And I looked at issues around juvenile life without parole, restitution, mandatory minimums in California, which, in hindsight, I was 18 and I was being exposed to sort of the glaring racism of our justice system on a daily basis. And people who are being impacted by that system. And I know that these experiences were also very informative for my practice. They made me understand that it was not enough to just have a place in the world. You had to work to participate in some meaningful way. And there's a quote that I remember returning to many times during this period. I was becoming pretty politicized as I was getting involved in journalism, which is maybe not an uncommon thing for people. But there was this quote by Kropotkin that I often went back to in this article that was called Anarchism, Philosophy, and Ideals. And he's sort of talking about how the natural sciences have expanded to understand not just the individual, but but individuals within systems, right? And I'll just read you this quote, which is, he says, "Each individual is a cosmos of organs. Each organ is a cosmos of cells. Each cell is a cosmos of infinitely small ones. And in this complex world, the well-being of the whole depends entirely on the sum of the well-being enjoyed by each of the least microscopic particles of organized matter. A whole revolution is thus produced in the philosophy of life." Not surprising that this is the person who also popularized the term mutual aid. So also around this time, in addition to sort of being exposed to news, in addition to becoming sort of more politicized, I was also introduced to a different kind of audio work than the news audio, which is audio documentary. And this, I'm going to play you a bit of the first piece that I remember sort of opening up, cracking that open for me. And I heard it at the Third Coast International Audio Festival. It was during a speech that by then host of Radiolab, Jad Abumrad. And it's a piece that's called If. And it's told through the voice of a young patient at a children's hospital. And I'm just going to play it for you because I don't think I can accurately describe it with words. I'll just refresh this.
If a fish trying to help someone, if I were a fish, if I were a finch, if I were a flame with a friend of a fish, if I was a bird looking at the children that were really sick, if I were a crocodile, if I were a plant, if I were a kitty, if I was a bird and I saw a bandage around someone's head, I'd pretend it was my nest and start laying eggs there.
If I was a bird.
Hanged on a tree well hidden. If I were a finch nesting and in the children's hospital and I saw a cast around someone's leg, I'd think, is that a big, what do they call those thing you find around in the beach? Scuttlefish, is it? Yeah. I'd think it was a scuttlefish and I'd start sharpening my beak on it. If I were a fish inside a fishbowl, in the children's hospital, I'd be thinking, who's in the cage? Is it me or is it you? Well, it's me, you fish.
All right. So that was sort of my first exposure to audio documentary. In other words, audio works that were, occasionally informative, but were often impressionistic. And I was immediately drawn to the emotionality, the intimacy, and the sort of formal elements of these audio works that were not news. I left youth radio at 20 years old and I went off to college, and I'm going to skip forward through a lot of college, mostly for time. And all that you need to know about my life between the periods of the age of 15 and 22 is that I partied a lot, I worked a lot, I fell in love for the first time. I continued to make audio work sort of in my own time and for classes. And, this was 2014, and what many people consider the beginning of the refugee crisis from Central America, and what others consider the beginning of people starting to pay attention to that. And I think that there were a couple of reasons that I was particularly drawn to this when it was happening, which was, of course, first, that my mom's side of the family is from El Salvador. And it was the country at the time with the highest number of children who were being detained at the border. And as someone who benefited from being a US citizen and also had historical ties to El Salvador, I felt a certain amount of duty to engage with what was happening. And then third, there was, of course, the part of me that wanted to visit the place that my family had come from, a place that because of dislocation and because of absences, I had never had the opportunity to visit. And I ultimately wanted to understand the ways that the history and the present connected. And from the little that I knew from my mom's books and what she had told me, I understood that the United States had played a large role in the destabilization of El Salvador before, during, and after the armed conflict. But my interest was not in rehashing the history that I had read in these books. It was in understanding sort of what this had meant for individuals and families on a daily basis, sort of the emotional and mental dimensions and the ways that they viewed the world. And so I got a grant from my university to work on a project where I was asked to do just that. And this college project ended up becoming a multinational multimedia exhibit in partnership with 10 Salvadoran artists and collectives, community organizations across the US and El Salvador, and exhibits in Long Island, Brooklyn, Washington, DC, and Maryland, Los Angeles, San Salvador, and Santa Ana. And so what began as a sort of short, what was supposed to be a very short project, ended up becoming a 4-year-long exhibit. And so I'm going to show you some pictures here. This is from the exhibit in San Salvador. This is from part of it that was Las Mesas, which is the thing that myself and my team contributed, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about that in detail. Here, the tables were mounted on the walls, so I know the title might be a little confusing for those of you who speak Spanish. This is from one of the artists that we partnered with, who is part of the exhibit, Dani Zabaleta, which is part of a larger art piece that I really love. This is a interactive wall that we carried with us to every single one of the exhibit spaces. We asked people to leave objects, leave notes, leave photographs, leave memories about what the legacy of the war had meant to them and to their families. And we carried and collected every single one of those objects and brought it with us on this tour. And so by the time that we got to Santa Ana, this whole wall was filled with photographs and notes from different people who had visited the exhibit. And like I mentioned, my team's contribution to the exhibit was called Las Mesas. And what that was a series, it was 10 tables. We interviewed 10 individuals and families, and then basically gave them a table where they shared with us a series of objects. And we took interviews that we had done with them and linked them to the objects. So you would come to a table and you could look and listen to objects at the same time. And I'll give you a better sense of what that actually means in a second. So here's, again, this is from the San Salvador exhibit. You can kind of see an example. This was from Patti Hernandez, who is an trans activist from El Salvador. And as you can see, various photos and objects here. And so you would get an MP3 player and each of these objects would be numbered and you could listen in order to her story, or you could jump around and listen to just objects at random. And so that's one example. Here's another one. This is Julio, who I'm going to talk a little bit more about. Julio and Dina are two narrators from this project. Julio lost his family because of a massacre, the El Calabozo massacre that was perpetrated by a battalion that was trained and funded by the US. And I was put in contact with Julio through an organization called Pro Búsqueda that is in El Salvador that helps connect people who had lost their families during the war and people who had been separated from their relatives. And, Julio and I became close very, very quickly. We met on my first day in El Salvador and spent basically from 8 in the morning until 9 p.m. Together. He took me to one of the schools. You can sort of see here at the top this whiteboard. He took me to one of the schools that he had been taken to after he had lost his family. We went to the shop that him and his wife owned in one of the marketplaces. And then we went home and we had dinner together. And this was the first of many years of communication and time that we ended up spending together, recorded and not recorded. And, we've remained friends since this project is finished. And I realize now in hindsight that I think we were drawn to each other because of sort of this thing that I mentioned at the top, right? Julio was someone who had grown up with no extended family and no history to speak of. And of course, we were coming from very, very, very different circumstances. But I think that we instinctively felt and saw in each other this common absence. And we were sort of, the way I think about it is like people on our own little island sort of waving at each other from the distance. Something that struck me, and part of the reason that this project took the form that it did, is something that struck me as I spent time with Julio, was that he had carried objects from his childhood into adulthood. So this is a picture of one of those, this frying pan that he was gifted when he was 6 years old at the school where this photo was taken, among other things, right? And this was a commonality with Julio and with many of the people who participated in this project, is that they had, through the war, through many houses, through many situations, had carried objects with them. And I'll say that I think that dislocation and absence can foster a certain predilection towards the material of life, right? Like, I mean, tangible mementos, tangible artifacts, and it changes the nature of your relationship to these things. I remember growing up that there were a number of objects that my mother seemed to carry with us from house to house, right? A metal plated Sacred Heart, Frida Kahlo painting of the little deer, this Balinese lion spirit statue that I remember chipping and breaking and her crying. And at the time, I didn't understand why that object had meant so much to her. And of course, as an adult, I understand that these objects and the few stories that my mother could share, the things that she held on to were testimony. They were our history. They were the traces that my mother had existed, that she had survived, and that she had created a home. And so when I met with various participants during this exhibit, I felt this in the ways that they had integrated what they had been able to take with them into their homes and into their lives as well. I'm going to share with you just one clip from Julio and Dina's table about when she first met Julio. And this is a photograph from their wedding.
¿Cómo conocí a Julio? Bueno, lo conocí en una ocasión muy triste, pues, porque como él estaba solito y lo que más, o sea, a mí me conmovía era la historia de él, ¿verdad? Cómo había quedado él en su vida huérfano, cómo se había criado. En el lugar donde yo me crié se escuchaba, ¿verdad? Y se veía quizás un 5% de lo que era la guerra, o sea, nada, por decirle algo. Cuando fue la guerra, como yo estaba muy pequeña, uno de la edad de mi hija puede estar pasando por cosas feas, y como uno es un niño y sabe que tiene un papá o una mamá, o sea, uno no sabe qué es la realidad de la vida hasta que uno crece o hasta que uno ve el sufrimiento de otras personas, se da cuenta qué es realmente una guerra o qué es realmente perder a sus padres, a su familia completa, ¿verdad? Porque por medio de mi esposo me he podido dar cuenta que sí, que en la vida lo más importante quizás no es tener dinero, sino tener una familia. Por eso yo a mi esposo yo le digo que cuide su familia, porque su familia es su hija. Ella es su carne, es su sangre y es lo único que tiene.
So the same year that I created Reconstrucción, I also created a piece called Espera. And I'm just going to show you like just the first minute of this film, which was visually and poetically influential to that piece. And you'll see why probably in a second. I'm just going to play maybe even the first 30 seconds because it stays. I'm just going to leave that there. It goes on like that for another 6 minutes. I was particularly struck when I first, I'd worked in audio for a while and was becoming interested in documentary and was exposed to this through a course that I took in experimental documentary. And I just remember being struck by the silence and the absence of this particular piece. And I think you'll understand and see sort of how that influenced the piece that I made next. So Espera, like I mentioned, I made Espera the same year that I made Reconstrucción, and they're very, very different pieces, at least on the surface. And I'm just going to play the first few minutes of this piece, and then I'll try to tell you how I feel they're kind of connected.
Coño. ¿Para qué me grabas? ¿Para qué me grabas?
Porque quiero recordar.
Pero me puedes llamar y podemos hablar. Y nos podemos ver. Sin compromiso. No quieres nada. Está bien. No hablemos nada. Ni tú eres mi novio, ni yo soy tu novio. No somos nada. Somos dos perfectos extraños en Nueva York. ¿Te parece?
Entonces, ¿cómo voy a llamarte?
Extraño.
Si estoy un desconocido y eres un desconocido, entonces, ¿cómo voy a llamarte?
Me puedes llamar. Oye, extraño. No te quiero dejar de ver. No te quiero dejar de ver.
Sí, pero tenemos que hacerlo.
Puede ser por unos días.
Creo que no. ¿No seguiste la historia?
Sí, la retomo. Estuvimos en un café un poco como ¿cómo se dirá? Como friki.
Friki.
Friki, ¿será?
No sé si esta es la palabra que usaría para este lugar. Un poco pushy.
Ok. Un poco pushy. Muy aburridor. ¿Por qué me llevaste ahí?
No sé, que hacía mucho frío y estuve pensando, bueno, tenemos que entrar en un lugar y no puedo pensar en uno que va a estar abierto. Y entonces por eso.
Y ahí estuvimos un rato, tomamos un café.
Tratábamos a practicar
el inglés. Sí. Y ya. Después nos fuimos. Nos despedimos en la estación. Nos dimos muchos besitos.
¿Qué pasó el domingo?
El domingo, como nos dejamos de hablar por WhatsApp, ya teníamos otra cita más. Y el domingo nos vimos en Union Square, ¿no?
Bueno, sí, que te encontré ahí para tomar el tren juntos a mi casa. Vinimos a la casa.
Sí. Estuvimos hasta las 2 de la mañana, 2 y algo.
Y estuvimos en la cama, besando, obviamente. ¿Y qué más? Ese fue el día que me dijiste, ¿no?
¿Qué te di?
De todo.
Sí.
¿Recuerdas cómo me dijiste eso?
Pues me estaba sintiendo mal, ¿no? Por haberte dicho eso y quería ser sincero. Quería que si era posible tener una relación de amistad, porque eso es lo que somos.
¿Qué me dijiste?
Te dije mi verdad. Te dije mi verdad, mi familia.
¿Cuál es la verdad?
Pues te dije que tenía mi esposa y mis hijos, pero también te dije que no he sido feliz en mi relación de pareja y que mis hijos son mucho para mí, pero con ella no me siento cómodo. Sí, tengo unos hijos que adoro, que amo mucho, sí, pero mi matrimonio no funciona. ¿Sí? Entonces mis hijos siempre van a ser mis hijos. Pero mi esposa no siempre va a ser mi esposa. Tu cara cambió.
Right. So this is obviously much more close than I had ever really been with my work. And I remember worrying about putting it out into the world. I remember worrying about what people would think of him, what people would think of me. And there were a few reasons I decided to make this piece, but the first was actually more of a question, which is the question was, am I alone? You know, the only way I would know the answer is if I shared the shame, the yearning, these questions with others. And the second reason I made it was, as I say in the first few seconds of the piece, it was as a document to remember. This document for me is a memento. It is proof of life. It's evidence of life, however blunderingly, being lived out in real time. And it is part of my history of who I am. And lastly, like all relationships, what was being documented within this work helped me locate myself in some ways as well. That process happens when we're connecting with anyone, right? And it happens especially in romantic relationships. They become a mirror. You know, who am I? Where am I? And you know, me and this person we share a yearning, and then we're also divided by our specificities. So looking back at the work I've made since these two pieces, I think that the timing of them was perfect. The rhythm of my practice was being concretized by them. And they also share a common theme, which is the search for belonging in a fractured society. What is love? What is family? What is home in a world that divides us from the very essence of ourselves through overt and subtle violence? Is it possible to find those things? And what does it look like when we look for them ourselves? And so part of what I think I've documented in these works in the last 15 years is that search, both for myself and in the lives of others. And one time as we were wrapping up Reconstrucción, one of my collaborators was talking with me and he says, you know, me and some of the other artists were talking and we were wondering what you are. Are you a journalist? Are you an artist? And I remember saying that I wasn't really sure. And I can now say with some certainty that I'm both. My practice, like life, is full of dichotomies and not opposition, but sort of in a divided equilibrium, sort of two poles on the same planet. I'm both a journalist and an artist. I'm interested in the past and the present, the intimate and the global, the external and the internal, the state of the world and the state of our emotional lives. And for me, it's not one or the other. I think some of the richest stuff of life lives in the in-between. Journalism, documentary, or artistic practices are tools that we can use to interrogate those in-betweens and to document our common search for belonging in whatever form that takes. And so I'm going to show you a little bit about the Quevedos, which is the piece that I did about my family. I began to sort of introduce. And this is my mother and my brother and me in bed. And I'm going to play you a clip, and I'll just say that though this piece was released in 2018, so about a year or so after Reconstrucción and Espera, it was a piece that was a lifetime in the making. I want to credit my aunt and uncle, Cathead and Carl, who bought me a tiny Zoom recorder when I was 18. I was still at youth radio at the time, and I began recording conversations with my mom, not with a particular end game in mind, but because I'd spent a lot of my youth trying to ask these small questions, hoping the answers would sort of bring me closer to belonging. And I wanted to document those answers as a sort of personal archive of our incomplete history. And so one day my mother called me on the phone and she told me that she had some important news that she needed to tell me about our family the next day. And so I brought my recorder with me and I'm going to play you a little bit of the Quevedo so you can hear what happens next. Important context for this piece, it begins at a wedding.
This story doesn't really begin at a wedding. It begins 4 years ago on Mother's Day. My mom, Maria, picks me up from my job. I'm a part-time busboy and part-time journalist at this point. The night before, she'd called me and told me that she had some news, but she needed to tell me in person.
So, I guess, you know, I know how you and your brother want to know more about our family. And so I had this idea that maybe for Mother's Day we could go to your grandmother's grave, we could talk about her and you get to know some more about her, because I don't think I've told you very much about her.
She's told me almost nothing about my grandma. I don't even know if she's dead or alive. The few details that I know are these. My mom's parents are both from El Salvador, but they met in San Francisco, California in the 1960s. My grandmother's name was Alicia. My grandfather's name was Jose Ignacio. She was 17, he was 37. They got married and had my mom. And then, one day, my mom left home and never went back.
I told you very much about her.
Yeah, I didn't even know she was dead.
Well, I thought she was dead, yeah. That's been my working assumption, because she was so sick, you know, when I left. And I didn't think she would get better.
My mom tells me that she asked her friend, Tim, who's a journalist, to look up information about my grandma. And he's found something.
He didn't find a grave, he didn't find a death certificate, but he found this woman who lives in San Francisco. We don't know for sure if it's her or not. She would be 66 years old. She could not be her, and I don't know. But anyway, there's no grave to go visit and talk about your grandmother, because we haven't found it yet. If it exists, then maybe this woman in San Francisco is her.
So I'm going to move pretty quickly just because I'm aware of time here, but I held on to that recording of us in the car for another 4 years after I recorded it. And I decided to make something of it after finding my grandmother's death certificate. And that decision ultimately ended up leading me to some of my blood family and some of our history, which makes up the narrative of this piece. And throughout this process, that same lingering question was in the back of my head as when I made Espera, which is, am I alone, right? Are these experiences my own, or is it something that other people feel as well? And so I'm going to just play you a quick clip that I think kind of gets at that. And then I'm gonna show you one more piece and then move on to the last thing.
To me, it had always seemed my mom's life was split in two. Life before Alicia's mental breakdown and life after it. And it was the after where things became vague, where chapters seemed to meld together and details became less acute. I knew my mom had lived in San Francisco in an anarchist commune. She had traveled to Europe, partly to hang out with some cute guy from a Swedish theater troupe. And then eventually, she had ended up back in San Francisco, where she met my birth dad and had my brother and I.
I think we're lost. Don't worry, we'll just go back to where we came. Which way did we come? We were crocodiles. Yup, we were scared.
My mom once called us orphans of history. And I think what she means by that is that we've never belonged to anyone, not to a place, an identity, a history. I've always identified as Salvadoran because that's the one part of my family's background that I know anything about. And even that's not very much. I didn't grow up taking trips to El Salvador as a kid or listening to Los Hermanos Flores. My mom, my brother, and I were all born in San Francisco. It's hard to explain the tiny world I grew up in. It was a happy one, but it's not one many of my friends could relate to. I still often feel like an alien, like I grew up in Earth's orbit. Close enough to see everything that was happening, but far enough away to never truly belong to it.
So again, similar themes: dislocation, incompletion, yearning, belonging, right? And I'm going to share one last piece here, which is the return, which I made the same year as this piece. So again, when I'm talking about sort of like the rhythm of my practice becoming concretized, this is sort of what I'm speaking to. So the return was a piece that I made with Javier Zamora, who is a Salvadoran poet, who was basically forced to return to El Salvador for the first time since he was a child to apply for a visa because temporary protected status was not renewed by the Trump administration, right? And so again, this sort of like this larger history coming to life in the present. And that was sort of the original premise, right? When I asked Javier to record himself during his trip. But as Javier and I continued to spend time together in the recording studio, I realized that the journey that he had gone on was about something much deeper than the visa. And though that process was obviously really intrinsic to the larger question of this piece. And so I'm just going to share a little bit of, oh, I guess it's not here. Hold on, let me pull this up. You know what? I might be missing these clips. Actually, I don't know what happened. I guess, so I'll just tell you about this piece then. So, and hopefully you can find it after the presentation. So the return is looking at Javier returning for this visa, and ultimately it's about him confronting, confronting his grandparents who were largely raised him through his childhood before he came to the U.S. And it's, a part of that process for him is realizing that these people that he's left behind have been affected by his absence, but have been affected by the absence of the other family members who have left. And, so it's about the country that he left. It's about the people that he left and how they've changed in his absence. And it's also about his grandparents and their absences and sort of what that has meant for them. And it's a piece that is about sort of like what is left behind during migration, the passage of time, the yearning to return home or to the past, which are oftentimes the same thing. And it reminds me of this passage that I return to often when I work. I'm a huge James Baldwin fan, and one of his favorite books of mine is Giovanni's Room, and this passage has always, I think, popped up for me as I work, in part because it's, again, connected to these themes that have existed across my practice. So they're having this conversation, and Giovanni says, well, isn't it true you don't have a home until you leave it? And then once you have left it, you can never go back. He says, I said, to have heard this song before. Ah, yes, said Giovanni, and you will certainly hear it again. It is one of those songs that somebody somewhere will always be singing. Both of these pieces went on to win or be nominated for various awards. The Return won Documentary Gold at Third Coast for documentary, and both received nominations from the International Documentary Association, which, maybe you don't care about awards, but feels pretty good. And I was going to share two of these pieces, but I'm just really aware of time and I want to leave time for us to have a conversation. So I'll just say two of the more recent works that I've done, both of which I just found out last week have been nominated for Best Standalone Documentary by the International Documentary Association, which is my third and fourth nomination in 1 year. I'm going to toot my own horn because I can. So The Weekend World is, it's the story of I think it's about 7 or 8 people around the world recording themselves across one weekend. And we've got folks in Kabul, Afghanistan, in Korea, in London. We have someone in Botswana. So it's mostly young people sort of talking about and recording sort of impressions of what the weekend looks like for them. And the other piece that got nominated is called Documenting a Death by Euthanasia, which is ultimately about Marika Vervoort, who is a Paralympic athlete who decided to end her life by euthanasia, and the relationship that she builds with Lindsay Addario, who is a photojournalist who basically followed her through this process over the course of 3 years. And so this piece with Marika looks at a very intimate relationship between a photographer and the person being photographed, and between an athlete and her body and a person and the medical system. And Weekend World is sort of looking at what are the ways that globalization has brought us together? What are the ways it's pushed us apart? What are the things that we share, right? Boring car trips, laughter with friends, music. What are the things that divide us? Nationalism, capitalism, war, indifference, fear. And why do we continue to sort of reach out again and again towards each other? And so I invite you to listen to those works if you have time after the presentation. And I'm sorry that I've run out of time to share them, but I want to give you, I do want to share this last piece, which is I'm going to share a work in progress that is called Orexis. It was funded by the Signal to Noise Award from Union Docs. And the term Orexis is a term that I found in the book Eros the Bittersweet by Anne Carson, which is a lovely book. And it's a Greek word that roughly translates to longing, desire, or appetite. And Carson writes sort of in comparing, towards the end of the book, in comparing desire and writing or reading, she compares them or sort of looks at them as parallel. And she writes, desire for knowledge is the mark of the beast. Aristotle says, all men reach out to know. As you perceive the edge of yourself at the moment of desire, as you perceive the edges of words from moment to moment in reading or writing, you are stirred to reach beyond perceptible edges, towards something else, something not yet grasped. The unpicked apple, the beloved just out of touch, the meaning not quite attained, are desirable objects of knowledge. It is the enterprise of Eros to keep them so. The unknown must remain unknown, or the novel ends. As all paradoxes are in some way paradoxes about paradox, so all Eros is to some degree desire for desire. What is erotic about reading or writing is the play of imagination called forth in the space between you and your object of knowledge. Poets and novelists, like lovers, touch that space to life with their metaphors and subterfuges. The edges of the spaces are the edges of the thing you love, whose inconsistencies make your mind move. And there's Eros, nervous realist in the sentimental domain, who acts out a love of paradox. That is, he folds the beloved object out of sight, into a mystery, into a blind point where it can float, known and unknown, actual and possible, near and far, desired and drawing you on. In other words, and this is me speaking, we need absence. The unknown and the unreachable are at the heart of how we love and how we create. And so I'm going to just play this work for you, and then we'll finish out and have a conversation.
Sí, es extraño. Es extraño, sí. Pero bueno, lo hemos llevado bastante bien. No es normal, eso seguro. Pero bueno, a ver, ya te digo. Mejor conservar una amistad que no perderla.
¿Y tú tienes preguntas para mí?
No sé, no me he pensado ninguna. A ver. ¿Por qué te arriesgaste en seguir estando en una relación con una persona en un país extranjero sabiendo que te ibas? ¿Seguiste manteniendo esta relación supiendo que ya te ibas? ¿Y que sería peor después? Tenías dos opciones, supongo, ¿no? Sufrir mucho al principio y perder la oportunidad de seguir. O disfrutar al máximo, pero luego sufrir el doble después. Eso es curioso. Porque dos relaciones que he tenido me ha pasado exactamente lo mismo. Siempre en el mismo dilema de seguir o no seguir. Y es mi karma este, yo creo. Con las relaciones que he tenido siempre me ha pasado esto. Que al cabo de poco tiempo me iba y tenía que decidir qué hacer. También decidí aprovechar el máximo.
Hello, good morning. Just wanted to send you a message to say happy birthday. Happy 25th birthday, I think. Anyways, yeah, just wanted to say that. Love you. I'm really happy that you were born. You know, despite all the bullshit, I'm really glad that we met, and yeah, I hope today is super special for you and you spend it doing whatever you want to do. So, anyways, I'm sure I'll see you around soon. I just got in, actually. I'm like waiting for the train. But yeah, I just wanted to say that. Happy birthday.
Me siento que no vale la pena amar a una persona que ya tiene que ir.
Al final, como que te curtes, ¿no? Que te haces muy resistente a esto y prefieres la seguridad antes de un amor pasional y breve.
Tú estabas la primera persona que yo amaba. Tengo miedo de que todas mis relaciones van a seguir este mismo camino, ¿no?
Sí, sí, claro. Bueno, sí, yo creo esto, que no hay mal que para bien no venga. Así que, no sé. Es que no sé.
So what I've learned through documentary and through journalism, through art, through life, maybe more generally, is that yearning is part of the nature of everything. Absence is part of the nature of everything. And they're there to remind us of what has been erased, what has been left behind, what we might reach for, what we might hold on to, what we might carry with us, where we might create meaning. And I used to believe that my absences and my yearnings were what separated me from other people, and that my pain was what made me different. Through this work, I've come to understand that it is those absences, those longings that connect me to the rest of humanity. Each of us is reaching out for something. That's what makes us human, as well as what we've carried and create in response to that urge. And the work I'm most passionate about honors the specificity of our individual experiences, histories, and contexts, and our common absences, our shared yearnings, peace, belonging, home, in whatever form those take. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm going to take a really big sip of water because I've been talking for a long time and my mouth is very dry. Thank you again, everyone, for coming. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. That was very wonderful. Very deep and moving.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad. I was talking with and I think, you know, for folks, this is probably true for most people, but especially I think with artists, you get to a point with a presentation or a work where you say to yourself, does this make any sense to anyone but myself? So I'm glad that it was coherent, at least, and understandable. And I really appreciate you all taking the time. I know I covered a lot of ground. And yeah, I'm really curious if folks have questions about any of these works and or anything that I've said. And you're welcome to type it out if your camera or voice shy, or just prefer to type things into the chat box. And then I'll also try to answer in sequence here as well. Francine, I see your hand raised and a thing. Would you like to ask me the question via voice? Oh, I think you're muted.
I'm mute. Yes, my question was, you referred to absence, and that got my attention. Do you mean like space? Because I noticed when you were showing objects in your art, there was this huge space between them. Is it the absence, or it's like space quality that you're?
Yeah, I think it's all of those, right? I think you know, me and the students in my class were just talking about, like, Espera, for instance, is filled with silences, filled with space, and then visually there's obviously something there, but there's a space there as well. And so when I'm talking about absence, it's on multiple levels. Like I'm speaking personally about absence of history, but I'm also talking about what is not, you know, what is not being said, what is not shown. Yeah, what you're sort of pointing out, right? What is around? What is the negative space between what is there and what isn't there?
But it almost seems like you're giving it a body when you present your work in the final outcome.
Yeah, I think I've become much more. I found myself, as time has gone on, definitely gravitating towards visual mediums, in part because I think, in part because of that instinct, for sure, of wanting to sort of find a way to, give body. I think I love that. I might take that. Give body to the silence and to the absence as well.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. I see a question here, and I'm sorry if you have your hand raised and you're on one of the other pages. I can only see one page at a time. I see, what is my relationship between spoken word and written text on screen? Yeah, that's a really great, that's a great question. I'm with Espera in particular, it was sort of twofold. One is that I mean, I'll say the big reason for me is that I'm very aware of, especially in works that are not narrated, that it's easy to maybe not on purpose, but to sort of erase our presence as editors, as people who are shaping and crafting narrative, right? And I think I was very aware of my role as someone who is creating a narrative in that piece. And I almost sort of wanted to remind the viewer, like, hey, there's an invisible hand here that is making these things move. And the text was a part of that. So that was part of it. So like, for those of you who do speak Spanish well, there's some translations that are not quite right. And that is not like that. I was aware of those when I went in, and I like this idea of sort of like tapping the audience on the shoulder and being like, hey, there's a person who is translating. One of the people who is in this conversation is translating this work. Not to say that you can't trust me, but that there is always going to be some subjectivity to the way that language is translated and the way that it's used. And then also just that, again, I think, because I have a background in poetry and writing and literature, I'm really interested in sort of, the feeling of words, right? And not just sort of blankly, just sort of translating a thing straightforwardly, but sort of trying to give some, to sort of give some body to the language. I'm going to steal your phrasing again, Francine, but just, this idea of the language being just as integral of an element as the voice or the visuals of the work, and not just sort of being this thing that we use so that we can understand what's being said. What has it been like engaging with oral history and oral history this fall? Has it changed the way you do or think about your work at all? Yeah, I mean, I think it is. It's been really interesting, especially to engage with the students in my class who are, I think, have a lot of really interesting ideas and work that they are doing. I think it has definitely forced me to be way more specific with the language that I use to describe my own practice, which has been really interesting. Especially, I think it's just I've been very much a fish in the water of media and of documentary in a way that has meant that I don't have to be as specific. Like I'll, talk to a friend who works in audio, and I don't have to sort of talk about what the elements are, why I've made certain decisions. And I think that that's sort of been the beauty of it in some ways too, is like really, it's been really forcing me to find the language and find the vocabulary to really describe things in detail. Yeah.
I'm just curious, where did you go to college and where are you teaching now?
I did my undergrad at the New School. I did global studies, and I'm now teaching at Columbia.
Okay. The New School is where?
University in New York City. It is not new. In fact, it is quite old.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Do other folks have questions? I see.
This feels like a very uninsightful question after a presentation full of deep insights, but I'm very curious, like how the romantic relationships, like those people and how your family how have they come to terms with having their private life displayed so publicly, or like how did you frame that to them? How has that whole process been?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and maybe this is a testament to how long I've been working in audio too. In some ways, I think people in my life, for the most part, are quite comfortable and kind of aware of the fact that I record so much. And there's a level of trust, obviously, between me and I think part of that also is the work that I've done in the past, right? Like I can show them that work and show like, look, I'm not going to make something that is disrespectful to who you are. I'm not going to tell a story that paints you in a bad light, because that's just not, I don't think I think everyone's capable of doing any kind of work, but I think, I think they're able to tell from the work that I have done that even in situations where I'm interacting or trying to tell stories that are very difficult or where people do not come off as great, that I'm always doing it with sort of the utmost sensitivity. And so it hasn't been terribly difficult to talk about or to engage people in documentation. But I do think, you know, I think it's always vulnerable to be documented. I feel it when I record myself. I think folks feel it when I record with them. And, you know, and there are continuing conversations. Like I think my mom, for instance, is someone who I've recorded a lot of over the course of my life. And we have a certain amount of intimacy and comfortability in our relationship that we can do that. But even more recently, she was like, you know, like we've sort of like started setting ground rules down for like, hey, like when you record, can we do this? Or like, hey, so it's always evolving. Like it's, you know, in parallel with the relationship itself in some ways. And I try to be as responsive and as respectful as possible to what people need in order to feel comfortable. And also sometimes I just don't, you know, some folks don't want to be recorded and I just don't record them, but it's pretty few and far between with folks in my life at this point. Do other folks have thoughts or questions?
Sayre?
Yeah.
Here, Florencia. You mentioned something very interesting. You said that audio is the most intimate way to tell stories. And of course, I would like to hear it from your own words.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah. I mean, I think I was probably being a little hyperbolic, but I also do think, you know, next to reading, which you mentioned, right? Like, I think it is very much, it is a super intimate medium in the senses that you're creating the images and you're creating a lot of the story in your mind. I mean, you were being obviously like there's a stimulus there and there's something to work off of. But I even noticed when I was playing some of these clips, I noticed folks closing their eyes, right? Like there's a certain ease that comes with listening because there's no activity to it. You are just I mean, it's not passive, but you are sort of like, you're taking in sound waves, right? These sound waves are hitting your eardrum and they're creating, you know, it's traveling up through your brain and you're creating meaning. And so there's this very internal sort of process in this way that I think, you know, reading is probably second to that in my mind, and that you have to sort of like, you have to look at something, but with audio, you can sit back and just let it sort of wash over you in this way that I think can be very, very intimate as well. And also just the fact that physically it's inside of you, right? Like it's not something that you're sort of like viewing from a distance. It is literally in your body. Yeah. I see some other questions here. Have you ever hit a point in a project where you question whether you have dug too deep regarding hidden histories? Have you moved past it? How have you moved past it, if so? I mean, the Quevedos was definitely one of those pieces for sure. I questioned, you know, after going to the wedding and after kind of coming home and actually beginning in earnest to work on that piece, I definitely wondered if I needed to just shut the whole thing down. And I think a lot of my process around figuring out whether or not I should continue to tell that story was about, how do I put this? I guess I ultimately, again, it's like that question, I hate to harp on my own presentation, but sort of like, am I alone, right? Like, it's like, ultimately what that knowledge created in me was this feeling of like, oh my God, how could how could any singular person live through this or handle this? And ultimately I felt that if I felt as alone as I did in knowing that information, that someone hearing that story and hearing me go through that might feel less alone in their experience of it. So that was a huge part of it. And again, sort of going back to this idea of sort of the memento as the document as a memento, I sort of felt like, well, I've never heard or sort of like engaged with a documentary work that is asking these questions. And at the very least, I would like to like leave this in the world for someone if they ever need it, if they can find it and, you know, and feel sort of less alone. But it's definitely difficult. And I feel that way. I mean, I've sort of this question of digging too deep. It's when you do intimate work, it's constant. It's a constant part of the process of being like, you know, even this piece that I just shared, I was working on it last night at a friend's house, and I shared it with them, and I was like, afterwards, I was like, is this weird? Like, should I share this? And my friend was like, no, it's beautiful, it's great, but it is like, it's like when you're that close to something, it's so easy. And that is part, you know, a part of these sort of absences and these growing up, trying to sort of figure out how to be human in some ways. And I want to share that vulnerability so that other people can kind of hopefully engage with that work and, you know, and not feel so alone themselves. Ambar, I see. To what degree do you experience people feigning familiarity with you because of the intimate nature of your work? Oh man, this is a great question. Do you experience this? How do you navigate that? Or rather, how do you handle people having opinions about you or your loved ones? I mean, I will say with the Quevedos in particular, that piece, it's happened less with me, but it definitely, I know, has happened with my mother, where my mom has said, oh, people will come up to me and they'll be like, oh my God, you're so brave. I loved your story. And she'll be like, I don't know you. Like, like I'm, you know, and my mom is fine. You know, obviously we had lots of conversations about sharing her story and what that looked like long before the piece ever came out. And so she was prepared. But it is, there's a certain amount of, and I don't want to dissuade it, right? And I don't want to discourage it, because I think like the fact that people feel so open to being vulnerable after listening to the works is like a great sign. But there is definitely, there are often moments where people will want to talk to me about that experience in a really in-depth way that I'm not quite ready for, or who want to like have conversations with my mother about the trauma that she's experienced. And part of it is like the privilege of the container of the story is that my mother gets to have me as the person that she tells it to, and then it exists within that thing. And obviously we have no control over how other people respond to it. But that was definitely, there's definitely some adjusting for sure after it came out, and we realized like, oh, right, like people are going to want to talk and ask questions about this. And my mother has her own boundaries and she can draw them very well for herself. So I don't, you know, I don't worry about her. And in my case, I try to be as receptive as possible, but it can be, yeah, it can be a little bit hard, you know, because it's like, I understand that I've volunteered this part of my life ostensibly to the public. But also sometimes you know, sometimes I don't want to talk about, sometimes I don't want to talk about it in depth with a stranger. And yeah, so it's difficult. It's definitely a balance. It's been a balance with a lot of these works for sure. Robert. And then I think we can do one more question after you, and then we'll have to go to close.
Well, first off, thank you very much, Sayre, for just sharing your story, share your life story, and sharing that intimate side of yourself to the public. So my question relating to that is, what was the process of preparation like? You know, because like in the standard oral history, there has to be a level of rapport. So what was that process of rapport, you know, listening to your mother's story, and then your second piece? Was there any rapport that had to be built, or what was that approach like when partaking this project for the first time?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. No, thank you. I appreciate that. I think, like I said, I think I'm lucky enough that I think I've built a real relationship of trust and confidence with most of the people around me, if not all of the people around me. And so, you know, with my mother in particular, I mean, I guess I'll start because they're two very different contexts. With my mother, I've been asking and talking about, you know, trying to talk with her. She was never resistant. Like, she was never like, I don't want to talk about this. She was just sort of, again, sort of like, there was a lot of absence in the stories that she was telling. There were a lot of things that were sort of unsaid. But that's been over the course of my lifetime. And I'm, you know, like I mentioned, 30 in 5 days, right? So there was a lot of time. There was a lot of preparation to talk about these stories with her. And then when I started recording, it was, you know, like I mentioned, my mother's a poet. And so I think she very much understands the power of testimony, and she understands the power of like documenting and putting something down on the page. And so it never was something where she was like, oh, why are you recording me? She sort of, I think, maybe instinctively understood where that was coming from, why that felt important to me, and understood that her story was also part of my story, right? That that I am who I am because of what she went through and because of where she ended up. And so I think she felt a level of sort of like, look, like I'm not interested, and you can hear this in the story. She's like, I'm not interested in engaging with this in a really like as much as you are, but I will do my part to help you do what you want to do with this and to engage with it in the way that you want to engage with it. And I think that was just sort of her feeling. I imagine is like some responsibility to me and to helping me understand where I'm from as well. But it's a boundaried process too, and there were a lot of conversations throughout between recordings of like, are you comfortable sharing this? Do you want to share that? It was all negotiated during the actual making of and after as well. Chunming.
Yeah, thank you for sharing all that. And I'm wondering, because I know that sometimes the intimate conversation, that the atmosphere can be very delicate and very vulnerable. So sometimes I may feel like the presence of a recorder or a camera will kind of intrude or spell that kind of atmosphere. So I'm very curious about like, how can you like keep things all recorded and but at the same time maintain the kind of intimacy and protect the like the delicate atmosphere of the conversation?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's I would say it's difficult because there's no one surefire way that it won't be a little awkward when you pull out a microphone. I do think part of it for me in my experience, in my practice has been that I often arrive to, if I know I'm going to record someone, oftentimes I'll arrive with the recorder already. I'll tell the person I'd like to record and then I'll already be recording. And that way that it's an element that is not being introduced as I'm pulling it out, but an element that is already there as I arrive. So that definitely helps. I think also some people have a tendency when they pull out a microphone, their mannerisms change, right? They sort of like, they get a, you know, it's sort of like oftentimes people project back the thing, right? So they'll feel uncomfortable. You'll feel uncomfortable because you're holding a microphone. And then the other person will see you feel uncomfortable holding the microphone and sort of echo that back to you in some way. And so I find that also just the experience of constantly recording has been really helpful in that as well, because then I don't feel uncomfortable when I pull it out. It's like, yeah, this is just who I am. This is part of the package. I have a microphone with me. I can remain relaxed. And then that signals to the person that I'm recording, like, okay, I'm not in danger. I can relax. This person clearly is comfortable recording. And then also it's just time, you know, a lot of it is just time. Like I think, again, there's the relationship of trust with family that definitely adds and expedites that. But a lot of it is just like, you know, coming with the microphone again and again, sometimes recording stuff that I know I'm not going to ever use, or just recording stuff for the sake of recording it so that it's sort of like clear, like, look, like I'm not going to, I'm sort of like, how do I put this? I guess I'm recording everything in a way, and that gets someone comfortable, sort of like, yeah, this is sort of part of the deal of being friends with Sayre, is that he will occasionally be pulling out a microphone and just recording our conversation, or recording the sound of the street, or recording, you know, and I have way too many recordings now on my computer, but it is, that helps with some of the comfortability for sure, I think. And I'm gonna just answer one last question here and then let's jump off. And I just, again, wanna thank all of you for being here with me and listening to this talk and asking such interesting questions. So I see Marwin asks, a lot of trauma is uncovered in doing this work. How should we responsibly handle and approach these conversations? That's a great point. I think especially, you know, and not coincidentally, I think like, you know, as a gay man, as a descendant of Salvadoran people, as, you know, as like people of color, like I think there's a lot of trauma and or elements of trauma in the stories. Not always, obviously, like lots of intersections here to talk from, but I'll just say in my case and in my experience, there's often, yeah, that is often an element. And I think that the responsibility we have around engaging with stories that have elements of trauma in them is the responsibility to the individual that is telling us that. I think that like oftentimes when I'm like, I try not to sort of think about it as like, oh, should I include this? Should I not include this? And more of like, well, like, what does this person think? Is this something that they want to share or not, right? Like with my mom, when she was talking about sort of what she had gone through, as I was including things in the work, I would hit her up and say, hey, are you okay if I include this? Is it okay if I mention this story that you told me? Is it all right if I mention this detail or what have you, like down to the most minute thing? Because yeah, because it is incredibly vulnerable to share that. Again, you know, like as someone asked in the question, right, like to share that with the general public without any sort of control over how they choose to respond. I think just sort of like trying as hard as I can to help the people that I am speaking with and documenting to be as much of a participant in the creation of the narrative as I can, right? And like to be really responsive to that in real time, as opposed to sort of like waiting till afterwards to be like, ooh, I don't know, was that ethically weird, right? Like to like just like send them a text message, give them a phone call and say, hey, is this okay? And that's been, you know, and that's a practice that I think I've learned over time through the different stories as well, because I don't think I did that. I don't think I did it well all the time when I first started. But it's something that feels, I think, important for me coming out of works to be like, I let this person be a part of this work too, beyond just sort of extracting stories from them. Okay, cool. Thank you all so much again for attending our last event, and I really appreciate it. Have a good night.
Thank you.